Hi, I'm Aria Sindledecker, and I'm 11 years old. I'm the author of Age of Aliens, Safire and Igneous, a middle grade sci-fi fantasy book. I'm also a World Reader champion, so I believe in literacy for all. Although my book is science fiction, my favorite subject is science. So today, I'd like to talk about a book and author that have made me more excited than the first time I saw Jurassic Park.
Ooh.
As far as we know, dinosaurs have always existed. But what was it like before we even knew they existed? In his book, The First Dinosaur, Ian Lendler tells us through fact, pictures, and humor how people stopped thinking dinosaur bones were from giant humans and started believing in dinosaurs through science. Believe me, this is a page-turner. Welcome, Ian, and thanks for joining us to discuss your book. So can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Hi, Aria. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm glad I managed to beat out Jurassic Park. I can't say anyone said that one before, but I'll take it. Well, wait, before we get started, can I just ask you, you said you were a World Reader champion. What does that mean exactly?
It's a group that helps people all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working with World Reader to raise money for Booksmart, a free app with lots of books that is helping to bring digital reading to a school in India. All my proceeds of my book will go to World Reader too, and World Reader brings digital books to millions of kids around the world.
Oh, that's excellent. That's a very good cause. I would fully support that. I was a great big bookworm when I was a kid. I read books all the time. I think it helped that we didn't have computers and video games and social media when I was a kid, because this was, books were basically the only entertainment I had. So yeah, I don't think it's that much of a surprise that I became an author. I originally, to answer your question, I originally was a picture book author. I love picture books. They're like small movies. I was like really obsessed with movies as well as when I was a kid. But as I've gotten older, I've got more and more into just reading about the world in the past and nonfiction. And so I'll tell you the quick story of how I came to write this book, which is that I was watching a David Attenborough documentary. Have you ever seen David Attenborough documentaries?
I haven't.
Okay, so he does all these documentaries for the BBC, and they're all about nature. Lots of things of slow motion sharks eating seals, and they're completely awesome. So anyways, in one of his documentaries, he talked about he was talking about hyenas and how hyenas are one of the most feared animals in Africa because of their bite force. They have the second most powerful bite force of any animal on the planet. The first is crocodiles. But he said they get along well with humans, even though they're very feared. And there's a whole tribe in Ethiopia that works with hyenas. And he mentioned that there was a professor at Oxford University, which is in England, who had a pet hyena. And he just, the documentary moved on. That was just a little thing he threw away and said. But I thought that was so cool. So I started reading up about that guy. His name was Professor William Buckland. He was the first professor of geology at Oxford. And as I read about him, he did a ton of interesting things. He had a pet bear as well. He brought the bear to parties and let him drink alcohol and dressed him in clothes. He ate the heart of a king, King Louis XIV. He literally ate his heart. He was famous for trying to eat every animal in the animal kingdom. So he would serve his guests fried mice on toast, crocodile steaks, horse tongues. He was really interested in eating things. And then this is just on Wikipedia. I was just reading very quickly. And in this whole long list of things that this guy did, he discovered the first dinosaur. And when I read that, all of a sudden I went, oh yeah, wait, dinosaurs are a thing we had to discover. It's pretty obvious. We weren't around during the time of the dinosaurs, unless you count birds. And that's when I fell down that hole. I just started reading more and more and more and more and more. And that's all of a sudden, by the time I was done reading, I had a book in my hands. So yeah, so that's how I came to the idea of how did we discover this thing that wasn't around before we were.
So how did you organize all that information?
Like that. Yeah. It was a lot of information. You're right. And not only that, I center most of my story around England. I've got my coffee cup here from one of my trips. But so the majority of the scientific work happened in England, but in fact, there was the scientific revolution, which took place mainly in the 18th century and the 19th century. And it happened all over Europe at the time, and they were taking fossil evidence from all over the world. Now, it so happened, the downside of the scientific revolution is that they were getting all these amazing samples that they were analyzing because Europe was a massive imperial power, right? So France and England and Germany, they had colonies all over the world, and they were bringing all these samples back. It didn't go so well for the people living in those countries who were native to those countries, but for the purposes of science, they were getting, like England was getting mammoth skulls from Jamaica. They were getting all these crazy animal samples and skull samples from all over the world. And they were realizing there's a story in the past that we don't understand yet. And so they were literally trying to tell this story. And so the shorter answer to your question is, how did I organize it? With a lot of index cards.
Yeah. Well, like when I wrote this book,
Mm-hmm.
I had to have all these chapters and write, oh, this happens. So I kind of understand the index card experience.
Right.
So how long did it take to get all that information?
Well, total, the book itself to write, to really, really, really be done, took 2 years. But there's many stages to writing a book. So for fiction, the stage is you start writing and then you feel like you're going to die and then you finish. That's my experience with writing fiction, which is why I never write fiction again. So by the way, can I just say, I'm very impressed that you managed to write a full book by yourself. Very impressed. Please keep going. I've done it, and I don't like the feeling when I write fiction. I feel like I'm lost in a forest with no map. And fortunately for me, nonfiction is a lot easier because you've got a map, you've got facts and reality, and so you can kind of guide the reader through it. You've always got an anchor to help you out. So I just kind of, I found the facts I could and lined them up in the most logical way. And then I made sure I had lots of really interesting anecdotes. You'll read stuff that doesn't necessarily relate to the story. Like the story of William Buckland, the sort of protagonist of my story, him eating the heart of a king doesn't really relate to dinosaurs. But if you read that, you got to put that in your book. You have to,
So did you go through debates with other people on what actually happened from all that research?
Well, that was a several stage process. So first I just did a lot of just learning, just autodidactic. That means you just teach yourself. You go to the library, you read tons of books, you go on the internet, make sure you go to the right internet websites and not websites that, it's amazing. If you type in dinosaurs, did they exist and how do we discover them? You'll instantly get a lot of very Christian websites that will say, well, they're just a fantasy. So I started doing that. And then once I figured out that I kind of had enough basic knowledge, then I moved up to the next step, which is online. There are tons of college courses that you can get for free. You can just, go watch a professor speak. Now they're a little dry because usually the camera's way at the back of the auditorium. And there's a little professor about that small on your screen way up front. But it's enough to kind of feel like, okay, what I'm learning is kind of in the general stream of how they would teach this course. And then I started just calling museums. Museums are there to help you. And they're like the University of Oxford, which has the archives of William Buckland. They have his diaries. They have all his class notes, his lectures, because he gave lectures. They still have that. And my wife is British. And so we go to England usually around once a year to see her family. And one time I called up the University of Oxford Natural History Museum, which is just one of the coolest museums on the planet. Like, they have Megalosaurus, they have the original first dinosaur skeleton. And I said, hey, I'm a random dude. Can I come and read the archives of William Buckland? And they said, yeah, sure. You know, I'm not a teacher. I don't have a PhD. I have no qualifications, but they just said, yeah, like their mission is to let people educate themselves and to educate other people. And so they let me do it. And they were really great to work with. In fact, most of the, a lot of the images in this book are from, like this one, like that. That's from the University of Oxford. That is the fossil that kind of broke open the entire discovery, because they were finding all these little fragments of bones and didn't quite know what they were. But when they found this, that's the actual photo. That's the jawbone of Megalosaurus, the first dinosaur ever named. When they found that, they realized, oh, all these bones belong to some sort of crocodile type thing. But Oxford is 60 miles from any body of water, from any ocean or any, large lake. And they said, how on earth is that possible? And that's what really started it. Right. And so that jawbone, that cool thing, I got to see it. I got to stand right next to it and get my picture taken, do my little fossil selfie, Yeah, so that's how I did it. Read some Wikipedia, then find some websites that I thought were, actually educational, then go online and find college courses and then talk to the experts themselves.
So from all that information, did you kind of find yourself wishing a little bit that you had become like a paleontologist?
Yes. I had, the best compliment that I got was I was talking to a class of kids, as high school kids actually, and they had been forced to read my book. And one of them said, we did geology last year. I wish I had read this book before we did that, because I did geology when I was like a freshman in high school, and it's a bunch of rocks, and I thought it was pretty boring. And then when I read this, like, I was really geeking out on geology. Like, I thought it was completely awesome, and ever since then, like, we'll go up to, Lassen National Park in California, and it's got all the volcanoes that it's possible. It has every type of volcano. And I was really nerding out. My kids were getting kind of like bored, but I thought it was awesome. Like when you get really deep into a book and you're finding it fascinating, that's the best thing that you can be doing.
So were any of the people you actually wrote about in the first dinosaur, did they inspire you?
Oh, totally. So one of the most important things, like foundations for just the discovery of dinosaurs, was a thing, let me see if I can find my book, was a thing called a cabinet of curiosity. And a cabinet of curiosity was basically, it was a form of entertainment starting around the 16th century. And it was essentially aristocrats trying to amuse themselves after dinner. Let's see, I think I've got one right here. Oh, yep. Well, this is a room. This was called a wonder room. This is one of the more spectacular ones. This illustration is from the 17th century. And it was literally, without TV, without computers, without radio, without any of that. If you were entertaining your friends, and this is an actual cabinet of curiosity, really, really rich aristocrats could have a wonder room, a giant room filled with stuff. And if you didn't have quite as much money, you could just build a little cabinet and fill it with cool stuff like seaweed and coins from other countries and like feathers and a couple skulls, that sort of thing. And they would just use it to amuse themselves and to pass the time. And more importantly, to study nature. Like, it was, cabinets of curiosity were about the glories of the natural world. And by collecting all this stuff, they were worth money. Like, all of a sudden people in mines and quarries and, people who worked in the outdoors would find stuff, and they realized, oh, they could sell it to aristocrats for money. And so they started gathering more and more of these things. And all of a sudden the fossil records started growing larger and larger and larger. And when a few of the early scientists, they called them natural philosophers back then, put all these bones together, they realized there's something happening. There's a story growing out of this. These bones are all interconnected, and it's a jigsaw puzzle. So my point is, as I was reading about all these cabinets of curiosities and these guys fascinated with fossils, I got really into it myself. and I have a dog, and we go for a walk every day, and we have some hills near my house. And so my dog started finding a lot of cool stuff. So I started, you know how like people will leave on the side of the road stuff they're throwing out. So someone was throwing out just a bookcase. So I just took the bookcase and I put it behind my house, and I started filling it with all the stuff that my dog and I found. So for instance, see that is a deer skull, right? And I had to learn how to do a little bit of taxidermy when my dog found it, because it was still kind of attached to the deer a little bit. It's kind of gross, but it was fascinating because you learn tons of things, like the character in my book, George Cuvier. He's the biggest genius in the book. He was the one who really figured a lot of stuff out. So for instance, you can see the molars, the flat molars. And again, this was stuff I was never interested in, like in college, but I got totally geeked out on it because flat molars are amazing, because it means this is without even knowing that this was a deer, just because these have flat teeth, you can tell it's a herbivorous animal. It's a plant eater, right? And you can extrapolate a lot of stuff because the eyes are on the side of the skull. Now, most herbivorous animals have their eyes on the side of the skull because they're prey, right? And so by having your eyes on the side of the skull, you can look a little bit behind you, and you can tell if a wolf or a coyote is trying to sneak up on you, right? Most predators have their eyes in the front of their skull because they're charging. They need better depth perception. So I started finding things like that. And then I started going, and once I got into it, coyote skull. This was a good find. All right. See that? So you can see, all right, see the eye socket is facing forward a little more because this one is looking for the coyote sneaking up behind him, and this one is directly oriented towards the coyote. He doesn't need to look behind him. He just needs the best vision he can to catch the coyote and chomp on him. And then I started finding really cool stuff. So I'm going to show you my best one right here. Let's see if I can take it out. It's going to be super gentle. Here we go. Okay. Let's see if we can see this. See that? Do you know what that is?
No.
That is the skull of a hummingbird. That was probably my best find. Me and my son found that one. And it's pretty amazing. Like, you can see the hummingbird has the largest eye socket to skull ratio of any animal in the animal kingdom. So look, you can see the actual socket of the eyes are taking up a decent 50% of the entire skull, right? And again, because the entire point of the hummingbird is to get into the flowers, so it needs to be able to locate the flowers, right? So I just started getting really fascinated with all that stuff and just collecting it, right? And my kids think I'm kind of creepy at this point, but because I have a collection of skulls in my backyard, but it's kind of cool. So yeah. So the answer to your question is I really started getting into collecting stuff like that, like just things from the natural world. And I got just more interested in nature. That was the point of my book was when I started writing the book, I wanted to write about nature because I don't know, it's nature was here before us and it will be here after us. And humans are just a passing fancy on this planet. And so I have gotten very interested in that.
So speaking of skulls,
okay.
In the book, you talk about anatomy theaters.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
It did make me sound a little disgusting, but it was really interesting. So what were some of your own reactions to the things you learned?
So this is an anatomy theater. This was one from the 1700s, and the Danish and the Dutch sort of had the best anatomy theaters at the time. And you can see what they're doing, which is they're taking apart that person. So anatomy theaters are really fascinating. And again, when I started this book, I thought I was writing about dinosaurs, right? But all of a sudden I discovered I was learning about the history of anatomy, because before you can figure out how the human body is made, or animal bodies are made, that you have to discover the idea that you can examine them. That was a whole field of science, the creation of anatomy as a science. And so the quick story to the history of anatomy is the ancient Greeks studied anatomy. They were fascinated with it. But when the Catholic Church came in, they banned dissection because they said it was sacrilegious to cut open a human being. And so for the next 1,500 years, somewhere around there, nobody was allowed to dissect a human being and sort of study it. And so the one remaining book from ancient Greece that every doctor relied on, there was a book that had survived that was the anatomy of a gorilla. And so all doctors were basing their examinations of the human body on pictures of a gorilla anatomy. And then in France, around the late 1600s, early 1700s, there were some doctors who just, we got to figure out what humans are made of, how we're made, how to do it. And the only way to do that is to cut people open. And so they would start grave robbing. People, thieves, whoever displeased the king would get hung in the town square on gallows. And at night, these med students would go and they would take the bodies and they would take them in the dark of night and they would cut them open and examine them. And the information they gleaned from this became so useful that the Catholic Church actually relented and said, all right, we're learning a lot from this, so kind of go ahead. And anatomy became, anatomists were like the rock stars of the science world at that point because they were learning so much and revealing so much. And that study of anatomy was actually helping people. It was helping the field of medicine. And so they became fascinated. So anatomists would actually go to parties. Imagine you have a party, your parents invite friends over, and maybe afterwards you play some music while you have drinks. Well, after the party, they would have drinks, they would eat, and they would have an anatomist come over and just dissect something in front of everyone. They would dissect a cow skull. They would dissect frogs. They never dissected humans as far as I can tell, although, that might have happened. And so it just became this cool form of entertainment. And so by discovering that, anatomists, they would started by dissecting human bodies and animal bodies. And then once you do that, you have an understanding of how bodies are formed and created and fit together. And when they came upon fossils, the early anatomists, Nicholas Steno was the most famous one. He said, these fossils fit together just like the anatomy of other animals. And once you start putting them together, pretty soon you'll form a dinosaur.
Yeah. So another story you mentioned is the one with the 6 blind men and the elephant. 6 blind men each feel a different part of an elephant's body. So their interpretations are completely different from each other's. So what does this really mean to you? And can you explain how it relates to the whole book?
Thank you. That, no one's asked me that before. That's a good question. So when I was writing the book, I started as a picture book writer. I'm a children's book writer by trade. And so I'm just fascinated with fables and things like that. So I've always known that story, and it's a really interesting story. And it's kind of like a giant metaphor for science in general. When we teach science in school, we tend to teach what's called the history of great men. And it's called that because, long before women were even allowed to practice science, it was all men. And it's simpler when you teach science to simply say, Einstein was a genius and he came up with this whole idea. No, he did, but there's a lot more to the story than that. And Stephen Hawking was a genius, came up with this idea. And even in my book, George Cuvier was a genius, came up with this idea. But it's never them alone. No scientist has ever all by themselves in a cave come up with stuff, except for that math guy in India who was in a cave and literally invent his own form of algebra. Anyways, that's a different story. But there's always assistants and other people and other scientists working all at the same time. And no one ever comes up with the full story. They'll all come up with one little piece of the story. And that's where I started thinking a lot about that metaphor of, one blind man feels the tail and thinks it's a rope, and one blind man feels the tusk and thinks it's a spear. And the whole point was paleontology, the study of dinosaurs and the study of animals in the past, was a completely new science in the 18th century. Nobody had any idea, they didn't know what they were studying. They were literally unveiling a mystery bit by bit as they were going. And so they were completely in the dark. And as they started, one guy in England would discover this bone, and one guy in France would discover this bone. And in North America, they would find a few bones and send it back. And everybody was making these little tiny discoveries. And it took the couple guys I concentrated on this book, it took William Buckland, George Cuvier, to take all those pieces. They didn't discover that much by themselves, but to take these individual pieces and just synthesize them together. And so that's why I use that metaphor, because the teaching of science, like I said, it tends to be done as one person, and it's never that. It's many, many, many people who work together.
And I like to include multimedia and drawings in my book, but use a lot of it to like just illustrate the whole idea, make it more visual, make it more book. What made you want to add all that in? Was it the age level?
Well, it's interesting. So when this book is written for middle age, it's called middle grade nonfiction. That's what it's called, which tends to mean like 6th grade up through like 9th grade. Now, the stuff I wrote in the book, any grown-up could read it. I kind of wrote it for myself at a certain point, you know. But the problem is, if I wrote this as a book for adults, it would just be text. It'd be kind of boring. But I'm writing about dinosaurs. Like, how can you write about dinosaurs and not have like pictures of bones and like all this stuff was happening in the 18th and 19th century. And so we have tons and tons of the original drawings of the people who discovered it. And like this, see that? That was the second dinosaur. That was the second fossil of Megasaurus ever discovered. And they illustrated it. They sat down. They were great illustrators back then, these guys. And some of the women as well became illustrators since they weren't able to do scientific work. William Buckland's wife, Mary Buckland, she became one of the earliest and best fossil illustrators. And when you have all these images and paintings, and I have their original handwriting from their classes, why wouldn't you put that in? You have to have pictures of dinosaurs, if you're doing your book. And so, for instance, this is, see that right there? That is Gideon Mantle, who discovered Iguanodon. That's his wife, Mary. And that's the tooth that she actually discovered on the side of a road in a pile of gravel. And from that one tooth, Gideon Mantle managed to figure out the idea that there was a giant 10-foot long, 9-foot high herbivorous dinosaur, which no one had ever thought of before. And, we've got that picture that's currently at the Museum of New Zealand Natural History. And, that's such a cool thing. So you got to include the photo of it. So that's why I just wanted to do it, because we have the images and they're really cool.
And I also noticed on top of all the images and everything that you use a lot of quotes. Mm-hmm. And so a couple of my favorites from it are, all truths are easy to understand once they're discovered. The point is to discover them, by Galileo. And mystery creates wonder, and wonder creates the basis of man's desire to understand, by Neil Armstrong. That's a great one. What's your favorite quote?
Well, when I was with that one by Neil Armstrong, again, that doesn't directly relate. A quote by Neil Armstrong does not directly relate to dinosaurs. But like I said, when I started writing this book, I thought I was writing about the discovery of dinosaurs. And then as I started researching and writing it, I realized I wasn't writing about that. I was writing about the discovery of science. And it really made me rethink science in general, because I was not a big science math guy when I was a kid. I was much more of English and reading and that kind of stuff. And I came to this thing of science is a tool. It's a tool that humans invented. Crows don't have science. Science is like a hammer or a screwdriver. It's a tool that we invented just to do something. And that thing that we're trying to do is just discover facts, find what is actually true. And because I started researching the history of science so much, again, I thought I was writing about dinosaurs, but I had to go back 2 centuries before they even really started figuring out what dinosaurs were, because that's where science began with Galileo. Galileo, he was the rock star that really started it, to be honest. Him and Copernicus. And I got really into science, and that quote from Neil Armstrong about mystery, that's what it is, because it was people trying to uncover the truth about something that for, a million years to human beings had been a mystery, right? And we're still in that process now. Science is always uncovering new things. It's fascinating.
So, in early drafts of the First Dinosaur, were there any parts or characters you just didn't like? Was there anything that you might have just gotten rid of? You might not have, because you just want to just uncover the whole truth, but...
Well, again, so when I was originally writing it, I was writing about William Buckland. And the thing that kind of ended up fascinating me was the fact that he wasn't trying to discover dinosaurs. That's not what he was there for, because you can't try to discover something that you don't know exists. He didn't know dinosaurs were real. He spent pretty much his entire life trying to prove that the Bible was true. And that's pretty much everything he did was devoted to. That's why he became a geologist, because he was trying to find evidence of Noah's flood. So he sort of gained his fame by finding these patterns of pebbles all over England. And he believed that that showed that water had moved them. Now, it turns out glaciers had done that. And he ended up sort of accepting and promoting glacier theory later in his life. He was a really fascinating guy. But I didn't go into this wanting to write about the Bible, but I ended up having to, because for a long time we've had this idea that science and the Bible, we're at this point now, especially in America, where we feel like science and the Bible are antithetical. They're not related. But all of the original people working on dinosaurs and early science, they were all religious people. They were all reverends and theologians, and they were all simply they called it the works of God. The Bible is the word of God. And the earth, the planet, the nature around us, things in the ground, those are the works of God. And they simply wanted to investigate that because they believed that was a second story that God was telling. So I ended up reading and becoming very interested in sort of the history of religion and religion as related to science. So I didn't really want to write about religion when I was writing about dinosaurs, but I had to, because that's the truth. That's where it came from. It came from the desire to understand God better.
And so, did you get rid of a couple of the goddish parts?
Well, anytime you write a book, so what's this book? This book is 200 and some odd pages. Anytime you write a book like that, to get 200 pages, I probably had to write 450, 500 pages, And then, you've written a book, what it's like. You have to go and you have to cut stuff out. And you find stuff that at first you're really, really interested in, and you write several pages about it, and then you realize that it doesn't relate to anything and no one really cares. That's just how it works. So, yeah. So anytime you're a writer, you're going to write double or triple what you intended to write, and then you cut it back down again. It's just, it's a mystery, right? It's just like science. You're trying to explore something that you don't understand, and then you just pick out the bits that tell your story.
So how did you cut back down on the antidotes, to make it not too much of to make it more about dinosaurs and not as much about the antidotes?
So I have a basic rule when I'm writing nonfiction, which is either I have to tell the story, the actual plot, move forward. Here's how we discovered dinosaurs, the step by step, or I have to explain something. Like if there's an actual theory or an idea that you have to understand that, or something that's funny. I'm willing to take a detour for a funny anecdote, right? William Buckland served fried mice on toast to his dinner guests. Does that relate to dinosaurs? No, but it's awesome, right? You got to keep that in. So that's my basic rule. And you get pretty vicious with it after a while when you're editing as a writer. Like if it's not the plot, if it's not an idea that needs to explain or funny, it's gone.
And so how did you put all the pieces together? So picture, graphs, quotes, text, to make it all balance and not have too much of one thing in.
Well, that was an interesting process, which I'd never really done before, because originally I just wrote the text and I showed it to my publisher. And I said, and here's a few images that might go along with it. And my publisher, for how publishers work, they did a little sample chapter just to work on the design. Like it was literally the designers just thinking to themselves. And they put together the first chapter, and it looked like this. So they did it like this with that kind of background and a sticky note and a pencil. And then they got an illustrator to do stuff like that, like show the first miners discovering Megalosaur. And this was one of the earliest fossils of Megalosaurus discovered. This was the very first Megalosaur bone discovered. So all of a sudden, they were just doing that as a test, And I realized how visual they were making it. And that's when I realized how much leeway they were giving me. And so, it took me a year and a half to write the book. But all of a sudden, like you were saying, there's a lot of pictures, a lot of paintings, a lot of diaries, things like that. All of a sudden, I realized what they were going to let me get away with. And so I spent almost half a year just finding images. And it's not that simple because you got to find the image, you got to get the rights to the image. And sometimes I was calling historical societies in England run by a little old lady in her spare time. And sometimes I was calling the families of someone who had taken a photo of miners in the 1920s. You go down a lot of strange alleyways, but that was the publisher. The publisher let me do all of that basically. And that's how it happened. I wasn't originally intending it to be that visual. And then I realized they were basically letting me make a documentary film basically,
Yeah. So what's next for you? What books are you going to write during shelter in place? Is there?
Let's see. Oh, that's a good question. Well, I'm always working, right? So I'm currently writing a book about the history of mastodons right now because I've just become Mr. Paleontology. And I've got a book that just came out, which is nonfiction. It's the history of Aesop. In fact, there's another lecture in the Bay Area Book Festival. That is the history of Aesop the Fable Teller. And that one's fascinating. And then I'm working on my next sort of science-related book, which is about the history of artificial intelligence, actually. So this was sort of the history of science, and artificial intelligence is the future of science. And so I've become fascinated with that.
I want to read that now. You used to deworm animals at a zoo?
Mm-hmm. No. That was just a joke. So I've written a lot of different kinds of kids' books, and I wrote a series of graphic novels called The Stratford Zoo Presents, and they did like Shakespeare. The Stratford Zoo Presents Macbeth, The Stratford Zoo Presents Romeo and Juliet. And so I was just making a joke that I was that's my son in the background walking past. He features in the book, as a matter of fact, because to get some of these photos, I had a budget for it. Let me see if I can find the picture, actually. Here we go. So I had a budget, a very small budget for pictures and things like that, because all these images in the book cost money, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. And so at a certain point, I realized it would be cheaper to just take the photos myself. And like I said, I go to England like once a year to family. And so I went to the Natural History Museum to get a photo of Plesiosaurus, discovered by Mary Anning, who's one of the great dinosaur hunters of all time. And that was my son. And we managed to go into, and so thus, because of that, I got a free photo. And so I figured I'd have him in there just because he was one of my helpers on the project.
And so, what pieces of advice do you have for young authors like me or people who want to write nonfiction books or maybe fiction books?
I would say two things. For one, just, if you're choosing to write, you're doing something for yourself, right? Like, hopefully you can sell it, hopefully you can make money, and hopefully other people will enjoy it. But it really, and it's kind of cliche at this point, but it really is true. You got to do it for yourself because you're entertaining yourself just in your room by yourself. So do something you're fascinated with, right? Like I was into dinosaurs, and the more I researched this book, the more I got it. At no point did I feel like, I got to go work on my book. Like I really got into this, I got excited by it. So my main thing would be for anyone who's trying to write nonfiction or any fiction, just write something you just absolutely love and you're really fascinated with it. And the second part is, no matter how much you love it, it's work. At a certain point, there's hours you have to put in. Like, it's not easy. And just do the work. It's okay. Like sit down and plug away at it and it'll work itself out. You got to edit it down and you'll find your way. Yeah.
And so one last fun question. You mentioned you love Hawkeye in a different video, and I love Black Widow. So why do you think Hawkeye would win in a battle against Black Widow?
I don't know if he would win in a battle. So here's what I'll say. So I grew up reading comic books, Marvel comic books, which was basically all there were. Part of what I was talking about in the previous video was I was talking about the fact that I think you guys are so lucky right now because graphic novels are so completely awesome now. You've got Raina Telgemeier, you've got George O'Connor, you got Jean Luen Yang doing the Coders books. They're just amazing, but none of that existed when I was a kid because all comic books were superheroes. But I read a lot of them, and my favorite of all the Avengers was Hawkeye because Hawkeye in the movies is not as interesting as Hawkeye in the comic books. Hawkeye in the comic books, he was dressed in purple, which is way cooler than the military black he's always wearing now. And his backstory was completely awesome. He was like an orphan who ran away and joined the circus, and he was trained by a knife thrower. And he had a circus background. It was completely awesome. He learned to fly on trapezes and shoot arrows. It was completely awesome and way more fun than the Hawkeye in the movies, who's fine. He's cool. I like the actor. Hawkeye's great. But, he was really fun when I was growing up. I don't know who would win. The Black Widow, she kicks a lot of ass. I think from a distance, if it's a range war, Hawkeye's clearly going to win. But as soon as Black Widow gets up close, I think she's going to do pretty well for herself.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today, Ian. Things are tough in our new shelter-in-place world, so we do have to find new ways to entertain ourselves. So if you are looking for a fun and interesting read that will actually teach you something, then check out Ian Lendler's The First Dinosaur. And thank you to the Bay Area Book Festival for hosting this interview.
Wait, and check out Aria's book too. Aria, don't shortchange yourself. Check out your book. Hold it up so we can see it. There, now closer. God, this is Author 101. Show people your book. There we go. Safire and Igneous. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for all your questions, Aria. It was lovely talking to you.